He stepped into the cafe to kill some time. At the adjacent table sat a man who had been buried 3 months ago. I've never been superstitious, but that day it seemed like the world was playing games with my mind. It all started with an ordinary coffee. The autumn rain had been falling steadily since morning, turning the city into a maze of reflections and shadows. I ducked into the small corner cafe on 7th and Maple, more to escape the downpour than from any real desire for caffeine. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, but none of the few patrons looked up. Perfect. Anonymity was exactly what I needed. I ordered a black coffee, slid into a window seat, and buried myself in my phone, scrolling mindlessly through news headlines. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and coffee grounds, a comforting combination that should have put me at ease. Instead, I felt strangely on edge, as if something was slightly off-kilter in the universe. That's when I felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. I glanced up, scanning the cafe casually, trying not to look as unsettled as I felt. And then I saw him. At the table directly across from mine sat a man in a gray trench coat, a newspaper spread before him, his eyes focused intently on whatever he was reading. He had salt and pepper hair, trimmed neatly, and wire-rimmed glasses that slid slightly down his nose. His fingers, holding the edge of the newspaper, were long and elegant, the hands of someone who worked with information rather than tools. Nothing unusual about a man reading a newspaper in a cafe. Except I knew this man. Brian Mason. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips as recognition slammed into me like a physical blow. Brian Mason. Private investigator. Mentor. Friend. I had watched them lower his casket into the ground 3 months ago. An icy chill spread through my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I blinked rapidly, certain I must be mistaken. It couldn't be him. It was just someone who looked similar. A doppelganger. A trick of the light. But then he looked up, and our eyes met. For one brief, electric moment, I saw a flash of recognition in his gaze too. Not just recognition, there was alarm there, and something else. Fear. Regret. Before I could process it, he was on his feet, dropping a few bills on the table, folding his newspaper with deliberate precision. Then he was moving toward the door, his movements quick but controlled, a man who didn't want to draw attention by running but was very much in a hurry to be elsewhere. I sat frozen for half a heartbeat, my mind refusing to compute what my eyes had seen. Then instinct kicked in. I stood so abruptly my chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing irritated glances from other patrons. I didn't care. I tossed some money on the table and headed for the door, my pulse thundering in my ears. Outside, the rain had intensified, sheets of water cascading from leaden skies. I squinted through the downpour, catching sight of a gray trench coat moving swiftly down the sidewalk. I took off after him, dodging pedestrians wielding umbrellas like shields. Brian. I called out, but my voice was lost in the rumble of traffic and the persistent drumming of the rain. He was moving faster now, almost running. I increased my pace, splashing through puddles, ignoring the water seeping into my shoes. I caught up to him at the corner, where he was waiting for the light to change. My hand shot out, grabbing his sleeve. Damn it, Brian. My voice was shaking, from exertion or shock, I couldn't tell. He froze, his back to me, shoulders tensed beneath the wet fabric of his coat. He didn't turn around. You're mistaken, he said, his voice low and flat. But it was his voice. I would know it anywhere. No, God damn it. I was at your funeral. The words came out louder than I intended, drawing curious glances from passers-by. He wrenched his arm free with surprising strength and darted across the street against the light, narrowly avoiding a taxi that blared its horn in protest. He disappeared down a narrow alley between 2 buildings. I started to follow, then stopped at the curb. A cold fear gripped my chest, different from the shock of seeing a dead man walking. This was primal, a warning. Something was very wrong here, and blindly charging into a dark alley seemed like a good way to end up with my own funeral. I stood there in the rain, watching the spot where he had vanished, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew Brian Mason. He had been a private investigator, one of the best in the city. He had been my mentor when I was starting out, teaching me the tools of the trade. Then he had gone independent, taking on cases that others wouldn't touch, digging into corners that were better left unexplored. And then one day, he had dug too deep. Crossed the wrong person. They found his body in the river, a bullet hole in his head. Open and shut case, the police said. A PI who stuck his nose where it didn't belong and paid the ultimate price. I hadn't doubted it at the time. I had stood beside his widow, Lisa, as they lowered his casket into the ground. I had seen her tears, felt my own grief. But now, I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through my contacts until I found Lisa's number. I hesitated for a moment. What was I going to tell her? That I'd seen her dead husband walking around downtown. That would be cruel if I was wrong. But what if I was right? I pressed call. She answered on the third ring. Alex? Her voice was familiar, warm, but with a brittleness that hadn't been there before Brian's death. Liz, I just saw. I trailed off, suddenly aware of how insane I would sound. I took a deep breath. Listen, do you still have Brian's things? His papers, documents? There was a pause, long enough for me to hear her measured breathing. Alex, what's going on? There was caution in her voice now, and something else. Tension. I don't know, I answered honestly. But I need to check something. Another pause. Come over, she finally said. I'll be home all afternoon. I hailed a cab, gave Lisa's address, and spent the ride trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was someone who looked like Brian. Maybe grief and guilt had caused my mind to play tricks on me. But those explanations felt hollow. I knew what I had seen. Lisa lived in a modest brownstone in Park Slope, the same house she and Brian had shared for 15 years. She answered the door wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. There were shadows under her eyes, the kind that speak of chronic sleeplessness rather than a single bad night. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, letting me in. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. Maybe I have, I replied, shaking off my wet jacket. I followed her into the living room, which was exactly as I remembered it from my last visit, right after the funeral. Books everywhere, comfortable, worn furniture, framed photographs on every surface. Brian smiled from those frames, frozen moments of a life cut short. Or so I had believed. You want some coffee? Lisa asked, hovering in the doorway to the kitchen. No, thanks. I just need to see Brian's stuff. His case files, his notes. Anything from his last few cases. She studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded and disappeared down the hallway. She returned carrying an old laptop and a cardboard box filled with notebooks and folders. He kept everything, she said, setting the box on the coffee table. I haven't gone through most of it. It was too. She didn't finish the thought. Thank you, I said, already reaching for the box. This means a lot. She nodded, then settled into an armchair across from me, clearly intending to stay and watch. I didn't mind. I owed her an explanation, even if I didn't have one yet. I started rifling through the notebooks, scanning Brian's familiar handwriting. Case notes, interview transcripts, surveillance logs. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then I found a journal dated just weeks before his death. I opened it, flipping through the pages until a word caught my eye. Artemis. Not a name, but a code word, written repeatedly throughout the entries. I read further. Brian wrote that he had been approached by a man who claimed they were faking deaths. People who couldn't be bought, who knew too much, they weren't killed. They were made to disappear. A chill ran down my spine. Brian had been convinced that Artemis was a government program for identity substitution. People who knew too much didn't die. They were forced to disappear. Did Brian ever mention something called Artemis to you? I asked, looking up at Lisa. Her face paled slightly. No, she said, too quickly. What is it? I didn't answer immediately, turning my attention to the laptop. I opened it, relieved when it powered on without requiring a password. Brian had always been cautious, but he'd also believed in accessibility in case something happened to him. Like now. I checked his recent files and found a draft of an email saved the day before his death. If you're reading this, it means they've made the choice for me. But what if death isn't the end? What if I'm alive, but no longer myself? I closed the laptop slowly, my mind racing. Brian had seen me in the cafe. He had recognized me. But there had been fear in his eyes. If he was alive, why was he hiding? And who had he become? Alex, Lisa's voice broke into my thoughts. You need to tell me what's going on. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since arriving. The shadows under her eyes. The tension in her posture. The way her fingers nervously twisted the wedding ring she still wore. I think I saw Brian today, I said quietly. In a cafe downtown. I expected shock, disbelief. Instead, she closed her eyes, a look of profound weariness crossing her face. Was he alone? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. Yes. Why? She opened her eyes, and now there was a different kind of pain there. Because sometimes he's not. My mouth went dry. Lisa, what do you know? She got up abruptly, went to a bookshelf, and removed what looked like a normal hardcover novel. But when she brought it back and handed it to me, I realized it was a hollow book. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook. He gave me this a week before they found the body. Said if anything happened to him, I should wait 3 months, then give it to you. Only you. Her voice was steady now, determined. It's been exactly 3 months today, Alex. I was going to call you tonight. I took the notebook with trembling hands, opened it. Brian's handwriting again, but more hurried, less precise. Alex, if you're reading this, I'm probably dead. But here's the truth, Artemis isn't just a program. It's a division. They don't fake deaths, they engineer new lives. New identities for people who know too much but are too valuable or too public to simply eliminate. I discovered their existence while investigating the disappearance of Senator Wells's aide last year. Remember him? Suicide, they said. But I found him living in Seattle under a new name. I remembered the case. It had made national headlines briefly, then faded from the news cycle as these things do. They approached me 2 weeks ago, the note continued. Said I had a choice, die for real, or join the program. Become someone new. Leave everything and everyone behind. Including Lisa. I looked up at her. There were tears in her eyes now. He couldn't tell me directly, she said softly. He was being watched. But he left signs. Things only I would understand. I knew the body they found wasn't him. The dental records matched, the DNA matched, but it wasn't him. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, stunned. Because they made it very clear what would happen if I did. Her voice hardened. Not to me. To him. They'd find him and finish the job properly. I turned back to Brian's notebook. The final entry sent ice through my veins. I don't know who I'll become, Alex. But if we ever cross paths, don't approach me. Don't recognize me. It's not safe, not for you, not for Lisa, not for me. They're always watching. Always. But if you're reading this, know that I'm fighting back the only way I can, from the inside. Artemis has a vulnerability. A flaw in their system. I'm going to exploit it. And when I do, everything will come to light. The truth about Artemis. About all the others like me. Watch for the signal. A white lily left at my grave on the first Tuesday of every month. If it's ever not there, move. Get Lisa and run. It means I've been compromised. The final line was written in a different pen, clearly added later, trust no one. Not even me. I closed the notebook, my mind spinning. Brian was alive. Living under a new identity, forced to abandon everything he knew and loved. And he was working against the very organization that had taken his life from him. Have you been checking his grave? I asked Lisa. She nodded. Every first Tuesday. The lily has always been there. Until when? She met my gaze steadily. Until yesterday. There was no lily, Alex. For the first time. I felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. According to Brian's own warning, his absence from our lives had been compromised. And today, I had seen him. I had called out to him, grabbed his arm. In public. We need to go, I said, standing up. Now. Pack a bag, just essentials. Lisa was already moving, as if she had been expecting this moment. Where will we go? I thought of Brian's notes about the Seattle connection, about the senator's aide. West, I said. As far from here as we can get. As Lisa disappeared into the bedroom to pack, I turned back to the box of Brian's effects. There had to be more information, something that would help us understand what we were dealing with. I rifled through the remaining papers, finding nothing of immediate value, until my hand closed around something small and hard at the bottom of the box. A flash drive. I plugged it into the laptop, opened the single file it contained. It was a video file, dated the day before Brian's death. I clicked play. Brian's face filled the screen, looking much as I remembered him, but with a haunted quality to his eyes that I didn't recall. Alex, if you're watching this, then things have gone according to their plan, not mine. I don't have much time, so listen carefully. Artemis isn't just about protecting secrets or silencing whistleblowers. It's about control. They're creating a shadow network of people who officially don't exist anymore. People with skills, with knowledge, with connections. People who now work for them because the alternative is a real grave. He looked over his shoulder, as if afraid of being overheard, then leaned closer to the camera. I've embedded a file in this video. Technical details, names, locations. Everything I've learned about Artemis. You'll need specialized software to extract it. Check my old fishing tackle box in the garage, under the false bottom. The password is the name of the first case we worked together. He paused, his expression softening slightly. Take care of Lisa. And Alex, be careful who you trust. They could be anyone. Even. The video cut off abruptly. Even someone I know, I finished mentally. Even someone like Brian himself. I heard Lisa returning and quickly ejected the flash drive, slipping it into my pocket. She entered carrying a small duffel bag, her face composed but pale. Ready, she said simply. I nodded, gathering Brian's notebooks and the laptop. As we headed for the door, a thought struck me. Lisa, did Brian have a favorite cafe? Somewhere he went regularly? She frowned slightly. He liked that little place on 7th and Maple. Why? The same cafe where I'd seen him today. That couldn't be a coincidence. He had wanted to be seen, by me specifically. But why? And what had frightened him when I actually approached him? As we stepped outside, I scanned the street instinctively, a habit from my own PI days. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "My car's around the corner," I said, taking Lisa's bag. "Stay close." We had only gone a few steps when a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up alongside us. My heart rate spiked, and I reached for Lisa's arm, ready to run. The passenger window rolled down. A man in a dark suit looked out at us, his expression neutral. "Mr. Reynolds, Mrs. Mason," he said calmly. "I'm afraid we need to talk." I stepped in front of Lisa protectively. "Who are you?" The man smiled without warmth. "A concerned party. Please get in the car." "And if we refuse?" His smile didn't waver. "Then this conversation becomes considerably less pleasant. For all involved." I glanced back at Lisa, saw the fear in her eyes. But there was something else there too. Determination. She gave a tiny nod. "We'll follow in my car," I said firmly. The man's smile faded. "That's not how this works." "It's the only way we're going anywhere with you," I insisted, feeling braver than I actually was. He considered this for a moment, then sighed. "Fine. Follow us. Closely. Any deviation, and our arrangement ends." The window rolled up. We walked quickly to my car, parked a block away. As soon as we were inside, Lisa turned to me. "Alex, that was him." "Who?" "The man who came to see Brian before everything happened. I saw him through the window when he came to our house." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, watching the black sedan waiting at the corner ahead. "Do we follow?" I asked. Lisa was silent for a long moment. Then, "What choice do we have? They found us in minutes after you showed up. They've probably been watching me all along. Waiting." She was right. We were already in the game, whether we wanted to be or not. And the only way out was through. I started the car and pulled away from the curb. The black sedan moved forward, keeping a steady pace. "Did Brian say anything about who came to visit him? Anything at all?" Lisa stared straight ahead. "Only that he was from the government." "Not which agency?" "Just the government." We followed the sedan through the rain-slicked streets, moving away from the residential areas and toward the industrial district near the river. The same river where they had found Brian's body. "Where do you think they're taking us?" Lisa asked, her voice surprisingly steady. I shook my head. "I don't know. But I'm guessing we're about to find out a lot more about Artemis than Brian wanted us to." The sedan turned down a narrow street lined with abandoned warehouses, finally pulling up outside a nondescript building with no signage. I parked behind it, and we sat for a moment, gathering ourselves. "Whatever happens in there," I said quietly, "remember that Brian is alive. And he's fighting. So do we." Lisa reached over and squeezed my hand. Together. We got out of the car and approached the building. The suit-wearing man was waiting by a steel door, holding it open. "After you," he said, gesturing inside. We entered a dimly lit corridor that led to an elevator. The man used a keycard to summon it, then ushered us inside. There were no buttons, just a scanner. He placed his thumb on it, and we began to descend. How deep are we going? I wondered. And what waits at the bottom? The elevator stopped, and the doors opened to reveal a sterile, white hallway that would have looked at home in any government facility. We followed the man down this corridor to a door at the end, which opened as we approached. Inside was a conference room, modern and unremarkable except for its lack of windows. At the far end of a long table sat a woman in a charcoal gray suit, her silver hair cut in a precise bob. She didn't rise as we entered. "Mr. Reynolds, Mrs. Mason," she said, her voice crisp. "Please, sit." We took seats across from her, while our escort remained standing by the door. "My name is Director Harris," the woman continued. "I understand you've had a rather enlightening day. I decided direct was the best approach. We know about Artemis." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed her face. "Do you? And what exactly do you think you know?" "We know you're forcing people to fake their deaths and assume new identities," Lisa said, her voice stronger than I expected. "We know you did this to my husband." Director Harris studied Lisa for a long moment. "Not forced, Mrs. Mason. Offered. There's a difference." "Not much of one when the alternative is death," I interjected. "Fair point," she conceded. "But still, a choice. One that many have made willingly when they understand the full picture." "Which is what, exactly?" I demanded. She leaned forward slightly. "That some secrets are too important, some skills too valuable, to lose. Artemis provides a solution that benefits everyone. The subjects receive new lives, new purposes. And national security is maintained. By making people disappear." Lisa's voice was incredulous. "By ripping families apart. By preventing information from falling into the wrong hands," Director Harris corrected. "Your husband discovered something he shouldn't have. Something that, if revealed publicly, would have destabilized not just this country, but global relations. What could possibly justify this?" I asked. She smiled thinly. "That's precisely the information we cannot share. But your husband understood. Once he saw the complete picture, he made his choice." I remembered Brian's notes. He hadn't made any choice freely. He was playing along, working from the inside. "Why are we here?" Lisa asked suddenly. "Why reveal yourselves to us now?" Director Harris sat back. "Because Brian Mason made contact with you today, Mr. Reynolds. That violates the terms of his arrangement with us. And now we have a problem." My blood ran cold. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that typically has only one solution," she said coolly. "But I'm authorized to offer you both an alternative. Join Artemis," I guessed. "Disappear ourselves." She nodded. "New identities. New lives. Together, if you wish. Your skills would be valuable to us, Mr. Reynolds. And Mrs. Mason, your background in cybersecurity wouldn't go to waste either." I hadn't known Lisa worked in cybersecurity. Another piece of information Brian had kept compartmentalized. "And Brian?" Lisa asked. "What happens to him?" Director Harris's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Mason knew the consequences of contact. But if you cooperate, we might be persuaded to be lenient." "We need time to think," I said. "You have until tomorrow morning," she replied. 6 a.m. "We'll come to you." "And in the meantime?" Lisa asked. "You're free to go. But I wouldn't recommend trying to leave the city. Or contacting anyone. We'll know." I had no doubt they would. We were escorted back to the surface, to our car. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under streetlights just coming on as dusk approached. "What do we do?" Lisa asked as we drove away. I thought of Brian's warning, of the missing white lily. "We run," I said. "Now. Tonight." "But they said." "I know what they said. But think about it, Liz. Why would they let us go if they intended to let us live? They know we know too much. They're watching us, waiting to see what we do, who we contact." She was silent for a moment. "West, you said earlier." "Why west?" "Because of what Brian wrote about finding the senator's aide in Seattle. I think he left us a breadcrumb trail to follow. But we can't go directly there. We need to be unpredictable." I drove aimlessly for a while, taking random turns, doubling back occasionally, watching for any sign of surveillance. Finally, I pulled into the parking lot of a busy shopping mall. "We need to ditch my car," I explained. "It's probably being tracked." Lisa nodded, "All business now. I can rent one with my backup credit card. It's under my maiden name, not connected to any of our usual accounts." "Smart," I said, impressed. "Brian taught you well." A sad smile crossed her face. "We always had contingency plans. I just never thought we'd need them." We separated inside the mall, agreeing to meet in an hour at a coffee shop on the other side. I used the time to purchase prepaid phones, a road atlas, more reliable than GPS, which could be tracked, and some basic supplies. When we reconvened, Lisa had the keys to a nondescript sedan. "South first," I decided, studying the map. "They'll expect us to head west immediately. We'll go south, then cut across through smaller roads." Lisa didn't question the plan. As we walked to the rental car, I couldn't help scanning faces in the crowd, wondering, were any of them like Brian? People living lives that weren't their own, watching, reporting back. We were on the highway, heading south, when Lisa finally broke the silence. "Do you think we'll find him, Brian?" I didn't have the heart to tell her what I suspected, that Brian had broken his cover intentionally, knowing what it would mean. That he had wanted me to see him, to set these events in motion. That he might already be beyond our reach. "I hope so," I said instead. "But first, we need to find out what he discovered. What was worth all of this?" As darkness fell completely and the city lights receded behind us, I couldn't shake the image of Brian's eyes meeting mine in that cafe. The recognition. The fear. And underneath it all, something I hadn't identified until now. Hope. Wherever he was, whatever he had become, Brian Mason was still fighting. And now, so were we. I glanced at the flash drive in my pocket, thought of the fishing tackle box waiting in Brian's garage, now inaccessible to us. Whatever secrets Brian had uncovered about Artemis, whatever vulnerability he had found in their system, we would have to discover it for ourselves now. The road stretched before us, dark and uncertain. Just like the truth we were chasing.